We're going to talk about thinking skills and discuss the four thinking skills that the art department has decided upon using in a little bit more detail. So we'll summarize this slide here at the very end of our brief discussion, but I just wanted to have this presented for you so you have a good idea of what the four skills are that we will be discussing. So we're going to start with contextualization. You can see by the graphic on the right-hand side that objects have different meanings based on the context in which they are being interpreted. So first and foremost, think of a work in a big picture. So think of the object as the object itself, but then think about in different settings how that object might have a different meaning. So this is where the classic questions of who, what, where, when, why, and how come into play. Consider the time and the place of when the object is used and the kind of the values of the society that that object was utilized in at that time. This kind of brings us to that historical importance component. So when you look at the example here that's art related, the urinal, Marcel Duchamp was an artist who started out as a painter and then kind of got bored with that and decided to experiment with making art using materials that could be found in everyday stores. So the idea here is the ready-made object would be something that you could use in an everyday situation, but in an art gallery, it was changed and modified in some way, oftentimes with like a witty title that would allude to the object's use in everyday life. So think about the object and or the subject's use in everyday life within a culture, but then think about how that could possibly be interpreted or viewed in a different context. Continuing on, we have synthesis. So think about how when you're synthesizing, you're combining things that may or may not typically be combined together to form something new. So within writing, you have explanatory writing and an argumentative writing. Both of these are different styles that are trying to make sense of different pieces. So in explanatory, you're putting things together in a logical or perhaps a chronological sequence. In argumentative, you're using a thesis statement as the backbone, as a guide, and then you're building the argument around that thesis based on the research that you have conducted. Also with synthesis, you're adapting or changing or modifying items to create something that is new. Think about, different parodies of various musical genres where someone somewhere has taken the lyrics to an existing song and reworked them or modifying them, often, to poke humor, to add an element of humor to that particular song based on an event or just, kind of a parody of a particular artist. So with that being said, the word satire here is really important when you use synthesis in a degree. So think about multiple meanings and think about like even memes on the internet, how there is an implied knowledge of the subject matter, but then the words that are used or the Photoshop that is used adds an additional element, oftentimes humorous, but sometimes not, to the work. So again, with synthesis, remember that it's a combination of items. Moving on to reasoning. Reasoning has to do with layers of meaning. So with this, an inference is like an educated guess, but you could also make a conclusion based on the work itself, and perhaps an object was made 50 years ago. Society has changed over the course of that time, and now you, looking back, can make a conclusion based on what you know about the work or what about the artist or the society at that particular time and their values. So again, it's implied meaning based on information. When you think of the term doublespeak, these are words or phrases that could be interpreted in different contexts or different meanings based on where they might be found, particularly in like poetry or song lyrics. But the idea here is that the meaning has multiple interpretations. And oftentimes, the judgment or the reasoning that you're making here is based on sound principles or ideals. So, looking at our cartoon here, we have an artist painting a frog in a pond on a lily pad. But what gives us an additional element of reasoning is the spider that has descended from the attic. And you have an element of humor that's found there as well, but that gives you an additional layer of meaning to the work. Likewise, with reasoning, there are three main ways in which you can reason with a piece of work or with an artist's viewpoint on something. And you can look at that through morality or the idea of right versus wrong. You could look at it from a religious context, depending on the artist and the piece, or you could look at it from a scientific point of view. So when you look at those three items, they're similar yet different in the lens or the viewpoint in which you can approach the reasoning behind the artist's work. Finally, we have perspective taking. So in our graphic here, we have a political cartoonist or a cartoonist's kind of homage to the artist M.C. Escher and his kind of surrealist looking graphic illustrations. And with perspective taking, the key words here are point of view. So you're looking at an object or an artist or a work from multiple viewpoints. And as you look at those viewpoints, it's important to identify the bias or the lens in which the work can be viewed from. So as you consider that, look at the time period of the work. It may be a reaction to an event that has happened in history. Also consider the culture and the environment of the time in which the work was made, but yet also the artists themselves. So this is where personality, culture, and behavior are really important to consider as you engage in perspective taking. If you really want to dive deep into this, there's a theory of ecological systems, and the theorist's name is Urie Bronfenbrenner. And he takes a person and breaks that person's viewpoint of the world down through different systems, whether it be family-based, whether it be within the geographic location of where the person grew up, the values within that culture, that society, that government structure. And it provides a really sequential lens in which you can look at different points of view of an artist and a society. So again, with perspective taking, you're really sitting down and you're looking at how that work can be interpreted based on different viewpoints, different points of view. Finally here, again, we've talked about our four thinking skills, and this slide here gives you kind of the premise or the summary of what each of these skills represent. So as you go through, it's okay for you to use this as a quick guide, and then if you need additional help or information, go back through these particular slides and find a little bit more information about the skill that you're using and use that as a reference, use that as a guide.